Here's where we're up to with this epic project. We got the engine back in yesterday afternoon, which was a bit of a mission in itself because we had to support both the engine and the crossmember. The crossmember is really heavy. It's super thick and drum brakes and all the suspension's connected to it. It's the sort of your main strength beam in the car, I guess. The rest of it's just like a box van. So we had to support the engine on this, and the crossmember was on this gearbox jack. Juggled it all around, got it in there, bolted it up to the engine, and then we just lowered it down on top of it, bolted the crossmember in, all fitted all right. So it's good. This is kind of a test fit because we sort of did most of it on the ground. We didn't know actual angles or anything like that, but it was very difficult to do anything but that. So it's in there now. Had a look at it. It's good, but it needs more work. Those mounts, we haven't actually put the bracing on them yet, and they are pretty springy, as you'd expect, being a bit of mandrel bent pipe. So I had Matt come around again last night. This is kind of a bit over my head as far as the structural stuff on this, which is, this is what he does all day, every day, building truck bodies and stuff like that and extending truck chassis. So he came and have a look. We sort of edited what we were thinking of doing in the first place, and we're going to add another pipe section that comes from under here and goes up to here to sort of triangulate it, as he called it, to stop that from pulling downwards. So we're going to do that today. Same on both sides. It also allows access to the oil filter, which the plate design that we were thinking of doing would have blocked off the oil filter, which would have made it a pain in the butt to service. We're going to lift the motor up a little bit as well, probably just with some spacers on the engine mounts. The gearbox needs to come up as well, so we're just going to jack that up, but at the moment it's too close to the actual crossmember. That's why we've got to lift the engine up. We're lifting it up to accommodate the pinion angle, which the diff's been retrofitted. It's not meant to be in there, and Matt doesn't seem to think it was done very well, which we can tell because these things have been welded on the wrong way around. So they've just banged about 15 nuts in there to space the shocky out when that bracket's meant to be the other way around. So yeah, pro job. Could have been done any time in the last 30 years, so who knows. So this is our gearbox mount design. So as I said, it's a hang mount. So it's off a Toyota Hiace van. So that hangs from the floor, and the gearbox obviously hangs off that with a pin design. So to mount it to the floor, this is our original crossmember point. So that's where the back of the gearbox used to be. It's well forward. We can't do that because the fuel tank's here. So what we've done here is we've got a plate, a sort of a channel that goes up into that cross beam. It'll go like that. It'll get welded along the top here and plug welded on both sides. Matt's instructed me not to weld it acrossways because that creates like a stress point in that beam itself. Then obviously this plate here is welded on it and positioned over the top of the gearbox, so as to sort of have it at a point where it's not sort of, if we were going to put it here, but the gearbox is not far enough back for that, so we've got this spaced forward. Matt's cutting out a plate to go around here, pick up these bolts here. Those two bolts there aren't really very structural, and we don't want to use them because it'll probably break them out. This gearbox is really heavy, so it's going to have a full plate that goes around, and then a couple of side plates with bolt holes in them that'll be welded to that plate. All the while missing this, which is another story altogether. We're going to make an adapter for that. So it's all happening. It's a giant pain in the arse. Thanks, Millsy. So we better get going.
The Barra is in position but still requires more bracing to the crossmember for some extra strength. Some more steam pipe is going to be added diagonally across to the edge of the crossmember. This requires more drilling, cutting, die grinding and welding. To retain the standard exhaust manifold, we are going to try and space the turbo down by using a T3 flange plate. The threads are drilled out and gaskets are used on both sides of the flange plate so it can be used as a spacer. The turbo still touches the floor, so Al gives it a little touch up with a special clearance tool. Al's back on the plasma cutter and cutting out a radius for the gearbox hang mount. This plate gets bolted onto the back of the ZF 6-speed gearbox to even out the weight over 4 bolt holes instead of the 2 at the top of the gearbox. After first mounting the gearbox, it was realised that it was still sitting a little too low, so Al redesigns the mount and gets the gearbox to sit higher to the body of the car, giving us more road clearance. The mount is given a quick safety squint tack weld and then removed to be welded on the bench and have some holes drilled and tapped so the hang mount rubber can be bolted on.
We're just about ready to remove the engine and gearbox and crossmember again so we can finally weld everything up. We've ended up lifting the gearbox right up against the floor as close as I can get it. It's like, finger width from the floor. That's basically due to the fact that it was dragging on the road before. So we've got about 180mm clearance at standard ride height now, which is not heaps, but this gearbox is basically just a cube, so it doesn't really taper or anything. Like the old gearbox was probably a quarter the size of it. So it's probably got a bit more clearance than your average 180 dragging on the road, but it is something for Millsy to consider when he's driving over the top of things. So we've done everything we can with that. We've also, in the process, messed up all the clearancing up the front with the manifolds, so we're going to have to start that again. Turbo wise, it doesn't fit even with the floor clearanced. But in the process, we've also had I've been standing here holding turbos up, scratching my head for 3 hours, and I've also just realised that there's not much room for an exhaust to go through because the fuel tank is very close to the transmission. Fortunately, it does fit, which is one less thing we have to do, but we're not going to be able to run an exhaust past it, so that's cause for a bit of a rethink. So what we're thinking of doing now is mounting the turbo, pretend it's a truck, which it kind of is. Mount it backwards, like that. Air intake, exhaust out here and underneath here, so the exhaust will travel through this sort of sump clearance for what used to be a cross member, and back out the other side where it's supposed to be. The air filter can just be up under here somewhere. It's not going to be used as an off-road racing car, so it doesn't need anything special in that regard. Still a bit of room for the hot pipe to go through the intercooler, so it should work. We're just trying to figure out which turbo to use at the moment. So I've just got like every turbo that I can find in the shop and holding it up there and squinting. That's just a standard GT35, which is what this has got on it. We can just use something like that on it. Just have to get the right exhaust housing. It needs a pretty big housing on it to let this engine breathe, because even though this is a reasonable sized turbo, it's not real big for this engine. I'd normally prefer to put something a bit bigger on them, but they're pretty responsive with these on them. So it'll be up to Millsy what he wants to put on it. As long as I say it's okay. So it's time to pull this back out again, which isn't fun, but we better get to it.
The crossmember and the engine are once again being removed, but this time around it's a little easier than before. The gearbox is supported at the rear by a trolley jack, and the front of the crossmember is supported by some jack stands. Once the stands are in position, the crossmember bolts are given 3 ugger-duggers in reverse and the car is raised back up on the hoist. Some box steel is cut up and will be welded in for support where our sump recesses into the crossmember. Once the crossmember is done, Al welds the gearbox mount to the frame rail while I was up in the car preventing fires from starting by using a wet rag.
Because we've raised the engine up another, well, the gearbox up 70 mil and the engine up 17 mil or thereabouts. We've created problems with the inlet manifold and the exhaust manifold. Can't really avoid it because the gearbox has to not scrape on the road. So what we've got to do on this passenger side of the car is cut some more out. This problem is probably amplified a bit by the fact that the Barra's head is not symmetrical. They've kind of like started with the old single overhead cam head and gone, we need another cam because double overhead cams are cool, and just like put it over here next to the original one. So the head, it's actually sort of shaped like that. So it biases the inlet manifold right across. So we've got a lot less space on this passenger side of the car because you still want to put the crank centre line down the middle of the car. It also makes them look a bit odd when you stick them into a car because if you stand there and look at it for a bit, you go, oh, these dudes haven't put the engine in the middle of the car. So that's not the case, it's just a weird shaped cylinder head, but that's just how they are, so we have to live with it. So what I've done here is I've drilled a hole here, and what I do there is where you know there's going to be a corner or an intersection, so I'm running down there along that black line and then going straight back. It stops you from having like a crossover cut. So it's a pretty simple thing to do. You sort of pick your spot and you can make that radius as big as you like. I did it here as well. You can sort of see how it works. So it stops you having awful like cut sections where the two things cross over, which just looks terrible and is not very structurally sound either, because that point there where those two things cross over is probably going to create a crack if the conditions were right. Whereas if you put a curve on that corner there, it's sort of gets rid of that out of it, and it also looks a lot nicer, of course. So done that. I'm going to rip into it. We're going to have to do some serious floor strengthening on this thing, but it's just how it is. You can blame Millsy for that. I will. Let's do it.
With the crossmember welded up and the floor cut out, it's now time for the engine to be refitted to the car. The crossmember is first lined up and the car lowered down on top. This ensures that the crossmember is in the correct position to be bolted up to the body. The engine is then bolted up to the crossmember and the Bedford is lowered back down on top. With our crossmember already in position, it's as simple as lowering the car down, bolting up the gearbox hang mount and blasting the crossmember with some ugger-duggers from the rattle gun.
That was a bit easier on the third time around.
I've lost count. Let's go up and see if it falls on the ground. So far, so good.
Like a glove, Alan.
That was actually a lot easier doing it that way than on the table, eh?
Yes. But it's connected now, so it's easier. Before it didn't have any mounts or anything.
That's true.
We're all good. The paint's almost dry on that, so...
So where are we up to now? What's the go? We've cut the floor out.
Um,
We're still going to make that inlet manifold up.
Yep. Should have enough room for that now. Was the rear runners were clashing before, that's why I've only cut the rear section out, because the front's still okay.
And what's happening with the exhaust side? You still undecided?
We don't know what sort of turbo we're using yet, but it pretty much has to face, like the compressor has to face rearward so we can run the exhaust out here, because the fuel tank basically comes across there. It's got good clearance to the trans, but nowhere near enough to put an exhaust through it, and if you put it underneath it, it'll just scrape on the road. So it doesn't really matter because we've got to make our own manifold because it just won't fit. So which way the turbo faces is irrelevant.
And there was talk, you said something about using a BA manifold, but being
Yeah, because the BA, like the earlier version of the car that had these in them, had a different exhaust manifold on that put the turbo a bit lower and further forward, but at the same time we'd still probably have to go around and out this way, and it is restricts us to a GT30, like a T3 type turbo, GT35, and I think you're probably better off with a twin scroll with a little bit bigger turbine on this. The GT35 works great in a factory application, but it is on a little bit on the small side for an engine of this size and output. So may as well get a bigger one if we have to make one for it.
So has Millsy got a death wish? Because as far as I'm aware, these things are like dangerous on the road with a crappy old red motor.
I don't know, he built the RM250 death bike that broke my finger, so I'd say he probably has a little bit of a death wish. And he used to have a V8 turbo Hilux.
Yeah, that thing was cool, eh?
If you like flat brims and laying rail, yeah, it was cool. And GT42s.